Cold metal pressed into his spine. Not dramatic. Not poetic. Just cold. The air smelled like disinfectant and old sweat, the kind that never fully leaves concrete walls no matter how often they're scrubbed. Somewhere above, water dripped with mechanical patience, counting time better than any clock. Drip. Pause. Drip. Each sound landed heavier than the last. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, the camera outside the cell blinked. Just for a moment. Just long enough. By the time the guards noticed something was wrong, the night had already made its decision. Jeffrey Epstein was supposed to wake up to another day of waiting. Another day of lawyers, sealed documents, and carefully worded statements that said everything and nothing at once. Another day of being the most inconvenient man in America. Instead, he was found motionless on the floor of a cell inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, his body hanging in a position that would later be described with legal precision and human discomfort. They called it an apparent suicide. Apparent is a polite word. It means everyone can stop asking questions for a moment. Sirens echoed down narrow corridors that had heard them before, though rarely with this much attention. Boots struck the floor in a rhythm that suggested procedure, not panic. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else stared too long at the camera that had failed to record the most important minutes of the night. Cold metal. Still air. A silence heavy enough to bruise. Outside, the city was already waking up. Taxis honked. Coffee machines hissed. Newsrooms smelled fresh ink and burned toast. Phones began to vibrate on nightstands belonging to people who had spent years hoping this call would never come. A billionaire financier. A convicted sex offender. A man connected to presidents, princes, professors, and prosecutors. Dead. The irony arrived before the facts did. He had been arrested again just weeks earlier, charged with sex trafficking of minors. The kind of charges that turn polite smiles into urgent distance. The kind that make old friends suddenly forget your number. He was supposed to talk. That was the fear. That was the promise. A trial meant names. A trial meant records. A trial meant that the careful architecture of power might finally show its cracks. Instead, there was a body and a broken narrative. As the paramedics worked, one guard noticed a detail that would later disappear into paperwork. The cellmate was gone. Transferred. Alone, despite previous warnings. Alone, despite an earlier incident where Epstein had been found injured and placed under what was supposed to be heightened supervision. Alone, in a building where nothing important ever seemed to work at the right moment. The camera blinked. The guards fell asleep. The paperwork disagreed with itself. Bad luck has a pattern when it gets rich enough. By the time the official announcement was made, the story had already split into a dozen versions. Television anchors spoke in careful tones. Online forums erupted in theories that ranged from absurd to disturbingly plausible. Memes appeared before the coroner's report. Black humor spread faster than verified information, because sometimes laughter is the only way to survive the smell of rot. A man who sold access to power had lost access to oxygen. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang in the middle of the night. Someone answered it barefoot, listening without speaking, nodding in the dark. Somewhere else, a lawyer deleted a draft email and started over. Somewhere far from the prison, a woman who had been a girl once sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, unsure whether to feel relief or rage. Justice, it seemed, had taken the day off. They would say the system failed. They would say there was no evidence of foul play. They would say investigations were ongoing. They always say that. But the strange thing about that morning wasn't the chaos. It was the calm that followed. The way doors quietly closed instead of opening. The way questions were acknowledged and then starved. The way powerful names floated briefly to the surface and then sank without a trace. The camera blinked, and an entire future went dark. You could almost admire the efficiency of it. A lifetime of exploitation reduced to a footnote. A trial replaced by a press release. A man who treated people like currency finally becoming expendable himself. Cold metal doesn't care who you were. And somewhere between the dripping water and the unanswered questions, a realization began to settle in, slow and uncomfortable. Whatever had died in that cell, it wasn't the whole truth. Not even close. The question arrived before the autopsy. It crept into conversations like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave, hovering just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. What if this wasn't the end of the story? What if it was the point where the story was buried on purpose? You were expected to accept the explanation quickly. A man under pressure. A disgraced financier. A convenient psychological profile built in retrospect. Stress. Shame. Despair. A rope made from bedsheets and institutional negligence. Case closed, move along. But reality has a habit of coughing when it's told to stay quiet. Jeffrey Epstein had not lived like a man preparing for death. In the weeks before his arrest, he fought extradition, negotiated bail, and argued legal technicalities with the enthusiasm of someone who believed time was still his ally. He ordered custom suits. Updated his will. Spoke to lawyers daily. Despair doesn't usually schedule meetings. And yet, here was the official version. Clean. Efficient. Almost merciful. The question sharpened. Do you believe the truth always survives long enough to testify? Because history suggests otherwise. The system spoke in calm voices. Prosecutors expressed disappointment. Politicians offered condolences that sounded suspiciously like relief. The phrase justice denied floated through headlines, hollow and overused, like a slogan printed too many times. But justice for whom? For the men in the cell. For the girls whose names never made it into press conferences. Or for the invisible audience of powerful figures who slept better that night. The real problem with Epstein wasn't what he did. It was what he knew. He knew addresses. He knew schedules. He knew who liked privacy and who liked plausible deniability. He knew which doors opened quietly at night and which ones required silence as payment. And that knowledge made him radioactive. The media framed him as a monster, which was accurate but incomplete. Monsters don't build networks this sophisticated. Monsters don't receive private jets as favors. Monsters don't get meetings with heads of state. Monsters are solitary. Epstein was social. That distinction mattered. Because once you reduce a man to a caricature, you also reduce the scope of responsibility. One bad actor. One rotten apple. A convenient villain to absorb collective guilt. The world loves that kind of story. It lets everyone else walk away clean. But this was never a one-man operation. And somewhere between the flashing headlines and the silent files, a darker possibility emerged. Maybe Epstein's disappearance wasn't a failure of the system. Maybe it was the system working exactly as designed. The question shifted again, becoming sharper, more dangerous. If a man like this could vanish before trial, what chance did the truth ever have? Investigators promised transparency. Reviews were announced. Reports were written in language so carefully neutral it felt anesthetic. Cameras malfunctioned. Guards failed to follow protocol. Supervisors missed warnings. Everyone made mistakes, but no one made decisions. Mistakes are comforting. They don't imply intent. Intent is harder to swallow. And yet, patterns don't form by accident. Not at this level. Not with this many coincidences stacked neatly on top of one another like dominoes waiting to fall. The public demanded answers. The internet supplied theories. Some were absurd, some paranoid, some disturbingly grounded in fact. All of them shared one unifying belief. The official story was too small for the size of the crime. Epstein was gone. The questions remained. And then there was the most uncomfortable truth of all, whispered but rarely said out loud. The dead don't testify, and the living with power prefer it that way. This is the story of how a man became a liability. This is the story of how silence was monetized. This is the story of people who were never meant to speak, and a system that made sure of it. And it begins long before a prison cell, long before broken cameras and tired guards. It begins with a man who learned very early that in a world obsessed with wealth, morality is negotiable. And he negotiated well. Jeffrey Epstein did not look like a predator. That was his first trick. He dressed like someone who wanted to be ignored by history. Conservative suits. Muted ties. Shoes polished but never flashy. He spoke softly, with the careful cadence of a man used to being listened to without needing to raise his voice. No dramatic gestures. No visible hunger. Just patience. Predators who advertise themselves don't last long in elite circles. Epstein understood that instinctively. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and old money libraries, the kind of scent that suggested education without confirming it. When he smiled, it was slight, almost apologetic, as if he were grateful for your time. Gratitude disarms people. It makes them feel superior. That feeling is useful. He learned early that power doesn't announce itself. It waits to be invited. His origin story was deliberately vague. Born in Brooklyn. Middle-class background. Briefly taught at an elite private school despite questionable credentials. Somehow, improbably, he transitioned from math teacher to financial advisor for billionaires. The leap was so large it should have raised alarms. Instead, it raised eyebrows. Eyebrows quickly relaxed once money started multiplying. Epstein never claimed to be brilliant. He let others say it for him. He positioned himself as a facilitator, a connector, a man who could make introductions happen quietly. People who actually control wealth rarely want attention. They want efficiency. Epstein sold discretion. And discretion, when packaged correctly, is irresistible. He collected people the way others collect art. Carefully. Strategically. Not for beauty, but for leverage. Politicians. Scientists. Royalty. CEOs. Academics with fragile egos and generous grants. Each encounter was documented in memory, not on paper. Each favor created a debt. Each debt deepened the web. He hosted dinners where conversation felt oddly curated, as if topics drifted just enough to reveal weakness. He asked questions that sounded intellectual but landed uncomfortably personal. He listened more than he spoke. Silence makes people fill gaps with truth. Sometimes, he offered money. Sometimes, access. Sometimes, something far more dangerous. The illusion of immunity. His homes reflected this philosophy. Mansions with too many rooms. Private islands with no clocks. Corridors that seemed designed to confuse rather than comfort. Places where time lost its authority and rules felt optional. And then there were the girls. Not women. Girls. They arrived through whispers and introductions, framed as opportunities. Massage jobs. Errands. Modeling prospects. The language was always sanitized. Euphemisms do heavy lifting in immoral systems. They allow everyone to pretend they misunderstood. The girls smelled of cheap perfume and nervous sweat. They spoke carefully, eyes darting, bodies tense. Epstein noticed everything. He noticed who hesitated, who complied, who learned quickly that resistance was expensive. He rewarded silence. He punished curiosity. He normalized the unthinkable through repetition. What made him truly dangerous wasn't cruelty. It was routine. He turned abuse into an administrative process. Schedules. Payments. Non-disclosure agreements implied, if not always signed. The horror wasn't chaotic. It was efficient. And efficiency is easy to overlook when it benefits the right people. Outside his inner circle, rumors circulated. They always do. But rumors are easy to dismiss when they threaten comfort. Powerful men laughed them off over drinks. Lawyers advised distance without inquiry. Institutions preferred ignorance. Ignorance leaves no paper trail. When accusations surfaced in the early 2000s, they were treated like minor turbulence. A few settlements. Quiet deals. A plea agreement so generous it felt satirical. 13 months in a county jail with work release privileges. 6 days a week outside. Nights inside. A punishment that sounded severe until you looked at the calendar. Justice, negotiated wholesale. Epstein emerged older, slightly more careful, but fundamentally unchanged. If anything, the lesson was clear. The system could be bent, and he knew exactly where it flexed. He joked once, according to people who later distanced themselves, that he belonged to intelligence agencies. That he was untouchable. Black humor, perhaps. Or a test balloon. People laughed nervously. No one asked him to explain. Men like Epstein don't need everyone to believe them. They only need enough people to hesitate. By the time the walls finally began to close in years later, he had already lived several lifetimes beyond accountability. He had proof of concept. He had evidence. He had secrets that didn't belong to him alone. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an archive. And archives are dangerous when they threaten to open themselves. He didn't collect people because he liked them. He collected them because someday, he might need them to stay very, very quiet. And they did. Time behaved strangely in Epstein's world. It bent. It stretched. Sometimes, it disappeared altogether. On his private island in the Caribbean, clocks were unnecessary. Days blurred into one another beneath the sun, measured not by hours but by arrivals and departures. Boats came quietly. Planes landed smoother than questions. The sea looked clean from a distance, the kind of blue that suggests innocence if you don't stare too long. They called it Little St. James. A name that sounded harmless. Almost biblical. Redemption, maybe. The island smelled like salt, sunscreen, and money that didn't ask where it came from. Palm trees swayed lazily, indifferent to what happened beneath them. Security cameras watched selectively. Guests were encouraged to relax, to forget schedules, to indulge in the fantasy that rules belonged somewhere else. Epstein understood something fundamental about the wealthy and powerful. They don't want to feel evil. They want to feel exceptional. So he gave them that. Private chefs. Massages. Long conversations about science, philanthropy, and the future of humanity. The setting did half the work. When you're surrounded by luxury, your moral compass tends to recalibrate. Lines blur. Boundaries soften. Things that would feel criminal in a hotel room begin to feel like indulgences in paradise. And paradise, history reminds us, has always been a dangerous place. Girls moved through the island quietly, like background elements in someone else's vacation photos. They wore simple clothes. They avoided eye contact unless instructed otherwise. They learned quickly when to disappear. No one had to explain the rules. The rules were absorbed through observation. Through silence. Through the subtle pressure that comes when everyone around you acts as if something is normal. Normal is contagious. Visitors told themselves stories. They always do. They told themselves the girls were of age. They told themselves consent was implied. They told themselves it wasn't their responsibility to ask. After all, Epstein was a financier. A donor. A man photographed with presidents and royalty. Surely someone would have stopped this if it were wrong. Surely. The island itself seemed designed to confuse accountability. Winding paths. Locked buildings. A temple-like structure that invited speculation and discouraged questions. Rumors grew faster than facts, but facts require witnesses willing to stand still long enough to be counted. Epstein watched everything. From balconies. From behind glass. From conversations that felt casual but weren't. He rarely needed to instruct. The system ran itself. People self-selected into roles. Some complied eagerly. Some passively. Some told themselves they were just passing through. He offered hospitality like a trap lined with velvet. And then there was the plane. The Boeing jet that journalists would later nickname the Lolita Express, a title that sounded clever until you understood the implication. Flight logs recorded names and dates with bureaucratic indifference. Just ink and paper. Just travel. But travel is never just travel when it carries secrets. The plane connected Manhattan to the island to Florida, Florida to Europe. It moved bodies and silence efficiently. No customs questions worth remembering. No receipts that couldn't be explained away. Passengers joked, drank, slept, pretended. They left the island sunburned and relaxed, returning to lives built on public respectability. Epstein stayed behind, watching the wake fade into the horizon, already preparing for the next arrival. The contrast was obscene. Billion-dollar conversations about saving the world happened a few rooms away from rooms where childhood ended quietly. Champagne glasses clinked while fear learned how to breathe shallowly. Wealth insulated itself from consequence the way it always has. Black humor thrived here, though no one called it that at the time. Everyone sins on vacation, someone once joked, according to later accounts. Laughter followed. Laughter is a wonderful anesthetic. It dulls responsibility without leaving a mark. The island had no clocks because clocks remind people that moments pass and consequences follow. Here, time served Epstein. And for a long while, it served his guests too. But islands don't float forever. Currents shift. Rumors leak. And eventually, even paradise develops a smell that no amount of ocean air can erase. Somewhere far away, someone was starting to listen. And Epstein, for all his control, had begun to miscalculate something crucial. The silence he depended on wasn't loyalty. It was fear. And fear, given enough pressure, eventually speaks. The first voices did not shout. They hesitated. They arrived fragmented, wrapped in pauses and second thoughts, delivered through lawyers who spoke carefully and therapists who listened without writing everything down. These were not accusations looking for attention. They were memories trying to survive daylight. One girl described the house in Palm Beach before she described what happened inside it. The marble floors. The smell of citrus cleaner. The way Epstein walked barefoot, as if the place belonged to him on a cellular level. Another remembered the drive over the bridge, the moment the ocean disappeared behind hedges trimmed too precisely to be accidental. Details like these matter. Trauma remembers geography better than chronology. They were recruited the way most exploitation begins. Through someone they trusted or needed. A friend. A classmate. A woman a few years older who said the job was easy. Massage. Errands. Quick money. No experience required. Adults hear that and think opportunity. Children hear survival. Cash was placed on tables without ceremony. Instructions were vague at first. Boundaries tested incrementally. Each step small enough to rationalize, large enough to trap. If you didn't like it, you didn't have to come back. That sentence was repeated often. It sounded generous. It wasn't. Because once you've crossed a line, even unknowingly, the cost of returning becomes psychological. Epstein understood leverage in all its forms. He never needed threats. He relied on confusion, on the imbalance of age and authority, on the quiet shame that grows when something feels wrong but is presented as normal. He took notes, according to later testimony. Names. Dates. Preferences. Not out of obsession, but out of habit. A man who cataloged people for a living didn't stop at finance. When some girls tried to tell their parents, the responses were fractured. Disbelief. Panic. Silence. In wealthy neighborhoods, reputation is a form of currency, and spending it on truth is considered reckless. In poorer ones, there was fear of lawyers, fear of being crushed by a system that rarely sides with those who can't afford it. And then there were the police. Palm Beach detectives noticed patterns. Too many similar stories. Too many girls mentioning the same address. The same routines. One officer reportedly kept a binder that grew thicker by the week. This wasn't gossip anymore. This was a case. But cases don't live in a vacuum. Epstein hired aggressively. Attorneys with resumes that discouraged persistence. Investigators felt pressure that was never explicitly stated but always understood. Calls were made. Meetings were held behind closed doors. The language shifted from criminal to complicated. Complicated is what powerful people call accountability when they want it delayed. A prosecutor later described the situation as a balancing act. Protecting victims. Managing evidence. Considering resources. What he didn't say out loud was that Epstein's connections created a gravitational field that bent everything nearby. The eventual outcome was a plea deal so lenient it stunned even seasoned observers. Federal charges disappeared. State charges shrank. The victims were not informed in advance. Some learned about it through the news. Justice had been negotiated without them. One girl said later that the worst part wasn't the abuse. It was the moment she realized the system had chosen comfort over her credibility. That realization ages you quickly. It teaches you what kind of world you live in. Black humor crept in after that. Survivors joked about how powerful men needed more protection than children. About how silence paid better than truth. Jokes like these don't come from cynicism. They come from exhaustion. Epstein returned to his life with minor inconveniences and major lessons reinforced. The message was clear. Consequences were flexible if you could afford the right tone of voice. But something had changed. The girls talked to one another. They compared notes. They noticed patterns. They realized they weren't alone, and that realization was dangerous. Systems built on secrecy collapse when victims recognize themselves as a group. Years later, when journalists began digging again, they found stories that hadn't faded. Names that hadn't moved on. Trauma that had learned patience. These girls were never supposed to speak. They were supposed to age out, forget, disappear into statistics. They didn't. And somewhere in Epstein's carefully managed world, the first real crack appeared. Power rarely says no outright. It redirects. After the Palm Beach case settled into its quiet, unsatisfying conclusion, something remarkable happened. Doors did not close around Epstein. They adjusted. Invitations became more discreet. Meetings moved to private rooms. The volume lowered, but the music continued. He had survived contact with the legal system, and survival breeds confidence. The plea deal became a kind of unofficial credential. Proof that consequences were negotiable. 13 months in jail, most of it spent outside on work release, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. He returned to a private office. He conducted business. He slept in a cell that barely interrupted his routine. Punishment, reimagined as inconvenience. There was black humor in it, if you knew where to look. A convicted sex offender escorted daily by private drivers. A man accused by dozens of minors allowed to operate as if the verdict were a misunderstanding. The system smiled politely and looked away. Behind the scenes, documents moved like chess pieces. Non-prosecution agreements. Sealed records. Language engineered to obscure responsibility. The deal itself was so unusual that legal scholars later struggled to explain it without resorting to euphemism. Federal prosecutors agreed not to pursue charges. Co-conspirators were shielded without being named. Victims were excluded from the process entirely, despite laws designed to protect their rights. It was legal. It was ethical, according to those who benefited. It was devastating. One attorney involved would later claim he had acted in the interests of justice. Another suggested the evidence was fragile. Fragile is an interesting word to apply to dozens of consistent testimonies. But fragile evidence has a way of hardening when exposed to light. That was the risk. Epstein understood leverage better than law. He understood that institutions prefer quiet resolutions. They prefer deals to trials, closure to scrutiny. Trials are messy. Trials produce transcripts. Transcripts live forever. So he offered silence. Not just his own, but the silence of everyone who had crossed his path and preferred not to be remembered alongside him. He hinted. He implied. He let people connect dots without ever drawing lines. He didn't need to threaten. He let imagination do the work. Powerful people have vivid imaginations when their reputations are at stake. And so the deals extended beyond courtrooms. Universities accepted donations without asking uncomfortable questions. Foundations praised philanthropy while ignoring rumors. Media outlets softened language. Editors hesitated. Lawsuits stalled. Investigations slowed. Nothing stopped completely. It just lost momentum. Momentum is fragile. There was irony in the way Epstein presented himself during this period. He spoke about reform. About second chances. About misunderstandings amplified by sensationalism. He joked, darkly, that he had become a cautionary tale. Laughter followed, thin and uneasy. Black humor again. The kind that surfaces when everyone knows something is wrong but no one wants to be the first to stand up. Behind closed doors, victims watched the world move on. They watched their stories reclassified as allegations. They watched their trauma weighed against inconvenience. They watched the men who hurt them continue to fly, dine, and donate. Some tried again. Civil suits. Interviews. Letters. Each attempt required reliving memories that never really slept. Each attempt was met with delay, dismissal, or procedural fog. The message was consistent. You may speak, but don't expect to be heard. Epstein, meanwhile, refined his methods. Fewer risks. Tighter circles. More insulation. He had learned which lines could be crossed safely and which required camouflage. He underestimated one thing. Time. Not the kind measured in calendars, but the kind measured in cultural patience. Societies tolerate injustice until they don't. Outrage accumulates quietly, like pressure behind a dam. Years passed. Then something shifted. A new generation of journalists began revisiting old files. Reporters without personal ties to the original decisions. Editors less impressed by status. Survivors older now, steadier, less afraid of being dismissed as naive. The deals in the dark began to glow faintly under renewed attention. Epstein noticed. He hired more lawyers. He spoke less publicly. He tightened access. A man who had once felt untouchable began to move like someone counting exits. He was still confident. But confidence had acquired an edge. Because deals only work as long as everyone keeps believing in them. And belief, once broken, is very difficult to repair. The knock came early. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just firm enough to remove any illusion that this was negotiable. Agents stood in the doorway with practiced neutrality, the kind that suggests they have done this before and will do it again without losing sleep. Epstein answered in a robe, barefoot, hair thinner now, face older but still composed. He looked less surprised than inconvenienced. That detail mattered. Men who believe they are untouchable don't panic when touched. They calculate. The charges were federal this time. Sex trafficking of minors. Words heavier than before. Words that did not come with easy exits or weekend work releases. Words that implied discovery, not compromise. Handcuffs closed around wrists that had signed checks worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. Cold metal again. History has a sense of humor like that. Outside, cameras waited. The flashes were impatient, hungry. Epstein kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, posture controlled. No defiance. No apology. Just containment. A man trained to leak nothing. In the back of the vehicle, as Manhattan blurred past tinted windows, something shifted in the air. Not relief. Not triumph. Suspicion. This arrest felt different. The prosecutors spoke more confidently. Journalists asked sharper questions. Survivors were interviewed with a seriousness previously denied to them. Documents surfaced. Flight logs. Depositions. Old quotes that aged badly under new light. Momentum had returned. Epstein was denied bail. That detail sent ripples through the ecosystem he had built. Denied bail meant time. Time meant pressure. Pressure meant the possibility of cooperation. And that possibility terrified people far more powerful than the men now wearing an orange jumpsuit. Inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, Epstein was processed like everyone else, though nothing about him was ordinary. Guards recognized the name. Inmates whispered. Files were flagged. Protocols were discussed and, in theory, enforced. In theory. He was placed on suicide watch briefly after being found injured in his cell, an incident officially described as a possible attempt. Cameras captured nothing useful. He was transferred, then returned, then removed from enhanced monitoring. The rhythm was strange. Start. Stop. Adjust. Repeat. Mistakes piled up quickly for a facility that prided itself on control. Epstein's lawyers were suddenly everywhere. Filing motions. Requesting delays. Challenging procedures. Preparing defenses that assumed he would live long enough to need them. He met with attorneys daily. He spoke about strategy, not despair. About evidence, not regret. About what could and could not be proven. He still believed in the system's flexibility. Outside, the narrative fractured. Some celebrated the arrest as overdue justice. Others warned not to get comfortable. Social media oscillated between hope and cynicism. Black humor returned, sharper now. Jokes about broken cameras. About guards with narcolepsy. About a man who knew too much for his own safety. Laughing was easier than trusting. Because everyone understood the stakes. A trial would not be about Epstein alone. It would be about who enabled him, protected him, visited him, funded him, and ignored the obvious. A trial would turn whispers into transcripts. And transcripts don't blink. In his cell, Epstein adjusted to confinement with unsettling speed. He read. He exercised. He spoke politely to staff. He made requests. He watched. People described him later as calm. Too calm. He had spent his life surrounded by chaos he controlled. Now he was inside a machine that controlled him, at least on paper. But machines are operated by humans, and humans are predictable when pressured. Epstein understood that better than anyone. He wasn't waiting for justice. He was waiting to see which version of reality would survive. And somewhere in the building, unseen and unrecorded, a clock was ticking again. The Metropolitan Correctional Center had rules. They were written down. They were signed. They were filed. And that was where their power mostly ended. Epstein was supposed to be checked every 30 minutes. That was the protocol after his earlier incident. Not a suggestion. Not a guideline. A requirement. Someone was supposed to look through the small window in the cell door, confirm movement, confirm breathing, confirm existence. Someone was supposed to be watching. Instead, the night stretched long and unbroken. 2 guards were assigned to the unit. Both later admitted they had fallen asleep. Not at the same moment, according to reports, but close enough to create a gap wide enough for history to slip through. Fatigue was cited. Overtime. Staffing shortages. The usual bureaucratic lullabies. Explanations that sound reasonable until you stack them. The cameras outside Epstein's cell malfunctioned. Not all of them. Not the whole system. Just the ones that mattered. The footage existed, then didn't. Or did, but was unusable. Or was overwritten. The language shifted depending on who was speaking. Paperwork contradicted itself. Logs showed checks that did not happen. Signatures appeared where eyes had not been. Time stamps bent politely. It was negligence, they said. Negligence is comforting. It implies incompetence, not intent. But negligence, repeated this precisely, begins to resemble choreography. Epstein was alone in his cell that night, despite previous instructions that he should not be. His cellmate had been transferred earlier without clear explanation. No immediate replacement. Just space. Quiet. Opportunity. The building exhaled. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, something irreversible occurred. The exact minute remains unclear. The reports differ. They always do when certainty is inconvenient. When Epstein was found, the response was swift but oddly restrained. No chaos. No screaming alarms captured on leaked audio. Just procedure resuming its rhythm. A man had died. A problem had been solved. Outside the prison walls, disbelief spread faster than official statements. Social media didn't ask if something felt wrong. It assumed it. The jokes came first, brutal and immediate. Memes about broken cameras. About guards sleeping through history. About the safest place to keep a secret being a federal prison cell. Black humor thrives where trust has died. Journalists began asking questions that had been rehearsed for years but never needed until now. How does a high-profile detainee die under constant supervision? Why were safeguards removed? Why did every failure align in the same direction? The answers arrived slowly and said very little. Internal investigations were announced. Then expanded. Then narrowed. Officials expressed shock with faces trained to express shock. Responsibility dissolved into committees and procedures and future reforms. No one was charged with homicide. The guards faced consequences, but modest ones. Paper punishments. Administrative penalties. Careers dented, not destroyed. The system disciplined itself gently, the way it always does. And then came the autopsy. The medical examiner ruled the death a suicide. Later, under pressure, the ruling was softened to allow for debate. Independent experts disagreed publicly. Some pointed to injuries inconsistent with the official narrative. Others urged caution. Science became a battlefield of interpretations. Uncertainty was the only thing everyone agreed on. Epstein, the man who had controlled narratives for decades, had lost control of his own ending. Or perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps the ending had been negotiated like everything else in his life. The most unsettling detail was not the malfunctioning cameras or the sleeping guards. It was the timing. He died just weeks after his arrest. Before discovery. Before testimony. Before plea negotiations that might have included cooperation. Before anyone else had to sit under oath and explain their proximity to him. Convenient is a dangerous word. But it hovered anyway. People asked whether the truth had been murdered or merely allowed to die. The distinction mattered philosophically, not practically. The result was the same. Epstein was gone. And with him, a living map of a network that suddenly felt much safer. The watch hadn't been watching. Or maybe it had, and chosen not to remember. Either way, the night did exactly what it needed to do. And by morning, the most important witness in one of the ugliest cases of the century had vanished into paperwork and doubt. Cleanly. Almost professionally. The cell was smaller than the stories made it. Concrete walls. A narrow bed bolted to the floor. A shelf. A toilet that hummed softly, like it was embarrassed to exist. Nothing about the space suggested drama. That was the problem. This was not a place built for grand conclusions. It was built for waiting. For time to lose meaning. For men to shrink quietly while paperwork decided their fate. And yet, this was where one of the most consequential figures in modern scandal would end. Or be ended. The official narrative was simple enough to fit into a press release. Bedsheets torn. Fashioned into a ligature. Anchored to the bunk. The body found kneeling, not hanging, a detail that immediately complicated everything without stopping anyone from moving on. Words did the heavy lifting. Consistent with suicide. Preliminary findings. No evidence of foul play. Language like this doesn't explain. It pacifies. Independent forensic experts later raised questions that never received satisfying answers. Fractures in the neck bones that were statistically rare in suicides but common in strangulation. Bruising that suggested force. The absence of clear video evidence during the critical window. But statistics don't testify in court. People do. And Epstein was no longer available. The silence that followed was louder than the sirens had been. It settled over the case like dust over abandoned furniture. You could still see shapes beneath it, but touching anything disturbed the illusion of closure. Investigators reconstructed timelines that refused to align. They replayed security footage that skipped minutes like a scratched record. They interviewed guards whose memories softened with each retelling. Fatigue became the universal alibi. No one remembered the moment that mattered most. That, too, felt rehearsed. Epstein's lawyers reacted with controlled outrage. Publicly, they demanded answers. Privately, they packed up offices that had been prepared for years of litigation. Strategies dissolved overnight. Files that were supposed to become evidence became archives. Trials create exposure. Deaths create endings. From a purely pragmatic perspective, the outcome was efficient. The cell itself was sanitized quickly. Routine cleaning. Standard procedure. No shrine. No preservation. Whatever had happened there was reduced to stains and forms, then erased. The space returned to function, ready to hold someone else's waiting. There was something almost philosophical in that. A man who had reduced human beings to interchangeable parts was himself reduced to an incident report. Outside, survivors watched the news with a kind of numb clarity. Some cried. Some laughed bitterly. Some felt nothing at all, which frightened them most. There would be no cross-examination. No moment of public reckoning. No list of names read aloud under oath. Closure was promised, but closure without truth is just silence with good public relations. The rope became symbolic almost immediately. Commentators dissected it. Argued over knots and tensile strength like medieval scholars debating angels. The object mattered less than what it represented. A line beyond which answers could not follow. Black humor hardened. People joked that Epstein had finally stopped talking. That he had taken one for the team. That he had been Epsteined, a verb born overnight, defined by implication rather than proof. Humor is cultural diagnosis. When language invents new verbs, it's because old ones failed. Officials urged restraint. Conspiracy theories, they warned, erode trust. What they didn't address was why trust had eroded so thoroughly in the first place. Institutions don't lose credibility because of skepticism. They lose it because of patterns. And the pattern here was unmistakable. The cell was quiet again. No footsteps. No dripping water noticed. No camera blinking to acknowledge the absence. Whatever had happened in that narrow space, it achieved something rare. It ended a story without resolving it. And in doing so, it ensured that the silence would outlive the men. After Epstein's death, the world pretended to catch its breath. Newspapers printed lists of names. Flight logs, social calendars, guest books. Each name floated briefly in headlines, then sank like lead in water. Some were billionaires, some celebrities, some politicians, some academics, people whose public images were immaculate. But proximity alone did not equal guilt. No one could prove what happened behind closed doors. Not yet. Not ever, for some. The interesting part wasn't who appeared on the lists. It was who didn't. People with the power to erase themselves quietly did so. Lawyers drafted airtight denials. Publicists choreographed appearances. Foundations rebranded. Documents disappeared in the bureaucratic shuffle. Evidence, inconvenient or incriminating, vanished politely. Meanwhile, survivors continued to speak, but their voices were muffled under the weight of influence. Their stories made it online, in documentaries, in investigative articles, but often buried beneath endless commentary, memos, and competing scandals. Truth became a secondary character. Influence became the protagonist. Black humor persisted. It thrived in emails leaked months later. Notes in law offices joking that everyone knows, but we pretend not to, memes circulating in private circles, winking at the absurdity of justice in a world funded by wealth. The laughter was brittle, cynical, a way to survive witnessing power in motion. People debated whether the missing names were more damning than the present ones. Silence can be as loud as accusation. Some of the names, when traced, led to foundations, think tanks, private schools, even government advisory boards. Connections that made casual observers dizzy, but to Epstein's circle, they were logical extensions of trust, access, and discretion. And the pattern grew clear. The world was designed to absorb chaos only if it was convenient. If a narrative threatened too many reputations, it shifted gently. Some stories sank before anyone could hold them up. Others floated briefly, attracting attention, then disappeared under waves of distraction. Investigators felt the frustration acutely. Grand juries, subpoenas, sealed records. Files padded with redactions. Witnesses intimidated, sometimes overtly, sometimes subliminally. Evidence existed, but moving it into the courtroom became a labyrinth. The most chilling truth. The real architecture of control never needed to show itself publicly. Influence, secrecy, money, and fear did their work quietly. The rich and powerful remained intact, insulated by procedural fog and human weakness. And yet, the public caught glimpses. Flight logs. Testimonies. Conversations between lawyers. Each fragment was like a flash of lightning in a storm. Brief, illuminating, terrifying, but fading almost immediately. Names sank. Only the memory remained. Only the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had seen everything, catalogued it, and remained silent. It was the ultimate moral conundrum. Truth existed in private spaces, but public systems failed to retrieve it. History would record a man's death but not the full extent of the networks he maintained. Reputation outweighed accountability. Silence outlasted testimony. And so the ledger of culpability stayed largely unbalanced. A few names floated long enough to be scrutinized. Most sank without trace. In the end, the story wasn't about Epstein alone. It was about the many who moved in orbit around him, people who had choices, and whose choices determined which truths survived and which were buried. And the world continued, as it always does, pretending that everything that matters can be measured in headlines, court documents, and sound bites. Some names survived in memory. Some names were quietly erased. All of them carried the weight of someone else's silence. The ledger was never balanced. The names that should have floated sank. And the system, as it always does, moved on. Knowledge is heavy. Not the casual kind you store in books or spreadsheets, but the kind that lodges in your bones and makes ordinary life feel fragile. Epstein's victims learned this early. Investigators learned it too, slowly, in the way a person learns to fear the wind after seeing a tree split in half. And the people who had been in his orbit, the politicians, the socialites, the academics, learned it quietly, behind closed doors, often too late to escape its price. For the survivors, the cost was immediate and personal. Trauma folded into memory, into bodies, into speech patterns. Anxiety became instinct. Trust became negotiable. Many carried secrets they were told were their burden alone, the kind that no court could fully acknowledge. Therapy helped, but could not erase what had happened. Public acknowledgement was rare, delayed, or denied entirely. For those who had knowledge and power, the cost was existential. The knowledge that a friend, an acquaintance, or an associate had abused their position. That influence could be weaponized. That discretion could shield horrors. That they might be implicated, not by what they did, but by proximity. Money and status became a form of armor, but armor never made guilt disappear. Some spent nights wondering how far their silence went, who would remember, who might speak, and who might survive them. That constant calculation is exhausting. It wears down even the most composed ego. Legal systems, too, bore the price. Cases stalled, evidence was buried, and institutions had to reconcile the idea that rules were malleable depending on influence. Some officials reported sleepless nights, endless paperwork, and meetings that felt increasingly performative. Bureaucracy became theater. The price of knowing included constant vigilance and the careful management of perception, even when the perception was deliberately misleading. The ultimate irony. The men who had collected people like assets, the ledger of names, favors, secrets, was gone. The price of his knowledge now shifted. Some survived unscathed. Others would carry the shame of association, the terror of being exposed, and the awareness that being untouchable is a temporary state, dependent on silence. There was also a philosophical cost. Knowledge of human corruption, especially when the system permits it, forces a choice. Despair or complicity. How does one live in a world where the powerful escape consequence because the structures they built favor them? Many who survived Epstein's orbit chose the latter. Some silently protested. Few spoke out. And then there were those who tried to tell the truth, who weighed exposure against personal risk, who realized that speaking could undo them just as efficiently as the abuser's influence had once protected him. The cost of knowing is that it forces decisions without guarantees. Sometimes, surviving the experience meant never truly living again. The knowledge became a ghost, whispering in the corners of their mind. Power protects itself. Silence is currency. And truth, the inconvenient and stubborn truth, is often the most expensive thing of all. For Epstein, the cost of knowing ended with him. For the world, it only began. And the ledger, the one he meticulously maintained, the one he used to calculate leverage, fear, and silence, remained incomplete, scattered among people who were afraid to reconcile the sums. The arithmetic of accountability had never been this cruel. Some numbers were missing. Some would never be found. And yet, everyone who counted, knew. The cost of knowing, in the end, was survival itself. Sometimes the truth vanishes quietly. Not with a scream, not with a headline, not with a confession. Just with absence. Like smoke slipping through fingers, leaving only the smell behind. By the time the world realized what had happened, Epstein was gone. The men, the ledger, the secrets, all of it vanished in a cell that had witnessed everything and preserved nothing. Cameras blinked, guards slept, and the machinery of bureaucracy performed its familiar dance. Absorb, delay, forget. Historians, journalists, survivors, and investigators all reached for fragments. Flight logs. Testimonies. Depositions. News articles. Court documents. Each piece shined briefly under scrutiny, then sank into the flood of other stories, other crises, other distractions. Truth, they discovered, has a strange habit of drifting wherever the powerful allow it. Some tried to speak. Some wrote memoirs, filed lawsuits, testified to committees. Some even died trying to bring clarity to a system that prefers ambiguity. The stories existed, but the final narrative refused to coalesce. Power ensures that. There is irony in this. The men who had catalogued lives, used secrets as currency, and created a web of control was the first to be erased. And the very people who had once feared exposure, politicians, billionaires, socialites, watched the spectacle from safety. Silence became their shield. Forgetting became their weapon. The ledger was scattered among people unwilling to reconcile what they knew. In the end, the truth did not vanish because it lacked substance. It vanished because the world had no appetite for its weight. Too inconvenient, too heavy, too revealing. And yet, its absence spoke volumes. About corruption, about complicity, about the fragility of accountability. Black humor thrives here too. The absurdity of it all, the most powerful predator removed by inaction more than intervention, is almost comic if it weren't so tragic. Memes circulated. Jokes were made about the irony of a man with so much leverage finally being leveraged by nothing at all. Humanity's cruel sense of humor is inexhaustible. Philosophically, the lesson is bitter. Justice is fragile. Truth is negotiable. Memory, when unprotected, becomes fiction. And sometimes, survival requires participating in the erasure of reality itself. The cost was universal. Survivors bore trauma. Investigators bore frustration. Society bore unasked questions. And the ledger, the silent archive of favors, threats, and secrets, remained incomplete, scattered, invisible to the public eye, but alive in the shadows where power truly operates. Sometimes, the truth disappears not because it is weak, but because the world is unwilling to carry it. Sometimes, silence is louder than testimony. And sometimes, the last witnesses, living or dead, leave the stage before the final act can even be performed. Jeffrey Epstein was gone. The story was over, but the consequences were not. They lingered in whispers, in awkward silences, in courtroom corridors, in private jet logs, in the memories of those who had seen too much and spoken too little. And the ultimate irony. The man who taught the world how to use silence as a weapon is now a silent figure himself. Sometimes, truth disappears. Sometimes, it was never meant to stay. And in that disappearance, the world learns the cruelest lesson of all. Some secrets are too heavy to survive exposure. Some names are too powerful to float. And sometimes, the truth vanishes along with those who knew it. No fairy tale ending. No justice neatly served. Only reflection, bitterness, and the eerie calm of a ledger half remembered. Because in the end, power protects itself. And sometimes, it does so with the quiet efficiency of death.